Imagine this: you're sitting in a room full of people you've known for years, friends, family, colleagues, and yet you feel like a stranger among them. The conversation flows around you like water around a stone. They're laughing at jokes that no longer land. They're debating topics that feel strangely hollow. They're chasing dreams that once made perfect sense to you but now seem like echoes of someone else's desires. And here's the unsettling part: nothing has fundamentally changed about them. They're still the same people. The shift happened inside you. If this resonates with something you've been feeling, something you couldn't quite name until now, then what follows may be one of the most important insights you'll encounter. Stay with this exploration, because by the end, you'll understand not just why this loneliness exists, but what it's preparing you to become. And if you find value in this journey, share it with someone who might be walking this same solitary path. You try to participate. You smile at the right moments, nod when expected, offer the occasional comment to prove you're still present. But beneath the surface, something gnaws at you, a quiet, relentless awareness that you no longer belong in the world that once felt like home. It's not that you've become better than anyone. It's not arrogance whispering in your ear. It's something far more complex, far more painful: you've outgrown the very foundation upon which your identity was built. Think about that word for a moment. Outgrown. We use it casually when talking about clothes, childhood toys, old habits. But what happens when you outgrow the people who shaped you? What happens when the values that once united you with your community now feel like ill-fitting garments you're forced to wear? What happens when your questions become too deep, your curiosity too hungry, your vision too expansive for the conversations available to you? This is not a gradual drifting apart over geographic distance. This is not the natural evolution of friendships as life circumstances change. This is something more existential, more jarring. It's the experience of standing in the exact same place you've always stood, surrounded by the exact same people, and suddenly realizing you're seeing a completely different world. The lens through which you perceive reality has fundamentally transformed, and there's no going back. Here's the paradox that makes this so psychologically devastating: growth, something we're told to pursue relentlessly, becomes the very thing that isolates us. We spend our entire lives being encouraged to evolve, to question, to seek deeper meaning, to become more conscious. Yet when we actually do it, when we actually undertake that heroic journey inward, we discover that consciousness comes with a price. That price is loneliness. Not the loneliness of physical isolation, but something far more profound: the loneliness of seeing what others cannot yet see, of feeling what others cannot yet feel, of living in a psychological territory that few have the courage or inclination to explore. Carl Jung understood this paradox intimately. He recognized that the path of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are beneath the layers of social conditioning, is inherently solitary. Not because you choose isolation, but because psychological transformation demands a kind of inner work that cannot be outsourced, cannot be shared, and often cannot even be explained to those who haven't experienced it themselves. But here's what makes this loneliness so misunderstood: we live in a culture that pathologizes solitude, that equates disconnection from the collective with personal failure. We're taught that healthy people have thriving social circles, that well-adjusted individuals seamlessly integrate into group dynamics, that belonging is the ultimate marker of psychological wellness. So when you find yourself drifting from the herd, when familiar connections begin to feel strangely empty, the first instinct is to assume something is wrong with you. What if the opposite is true? What if this loneliness isn't a symptom of dysfunction but a sign of profound transformation? What if the isolation you feel isn't evidence that you're broken, but proof that you're breaking free from patterns that no longer serve your soul's evolution? What if the distance you experience from others is actually the necessary space required for you to finally meet yourself? These questions don't offer comfort. They offer something more valuable: a reframing of your experience from pathology to initiation. Because once you understand what's actually happening, once you see this loneliness not as an ending but as a threshold, everything changes. The pain doesn't disappear, but it acquires meaning. The isolation doesn't vanish, but it transforms into something purposeful. The truth is this: you are not losing your mind. You are not becoming cold, detached, or superior. You are undergoing one of the most challenging and least understood experiences of human psychological development. You are outgrowing the world that raised you, and that world doesn't have a map for where you're going. The reason this loneliness cuts so deep is because it strikes at the very foundation of human psychology, our need for belonging. From the moment we're born, we learn who we are through reflection. Your parents mirror back an image of you. Your friends confirm certain traits. Your culture validates specific behaviors while rejecting others. This mirroring process is how the ego forms, how identity crystallizes, how you come to understand yourself as a distinct being in the world. Carl Jung called this early adaptation the development of the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the collective world. The persona isn't false, exactly. It's necessary. It allows you to function in society, to earn love, to find acceptance, to survive psychologically in a world that demands conformity as the price of belonging. In childhood and early adulthood, this persona feels like your true self because you haven't yet discovered what lies beneath it. But then something happens. A crisis. A loss. A moment of deep introspection. A question that won't stop echoing in your mind. And suddenly, the mask begins to crack. You start to see the difference between who you've been conditioned to be and who you actually are. You notice the gap between the values you've inherited and the values that genuinely resonate with your soul. This is what Jung called the beginning of individuation, the psychological process of becoming yourself beyond the collective programming. Here's where the hidden problem emerges: individuation is not a collective journey. Everyone around you is still largely identified with their personas, still operating within the shared framework of beliefs and behaviors that hold society together. They haven't yet experienced the disorienting awakening you're going through. And because they haven't, they can't understand why you're changing. They can't comprehend why the old conversations no longer satisfy you, why the old goals no longer motivate you, why you seem to be pulling away from the very things that once united you. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer understood this isolation intimately. He recognized that most people live their entire lives in what he called the world as representation, a consensus reality built on shared illusions, inherited desires, and unexamined assumptions. To wake up from this collective dream, to see through the veil of cultural conditioning, is to become estranged from those still dreaming. Not because you want to be separate, but because you've accessed a dimension of reality they cannot yet perceive. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, observed something profound about human suffering: it's not the pain itself that destroys us, but meaningless pain. When suffering has no purpose, no direction, no potential for transformation, it becomes unbearable. The loneliness of outgrowing others is particularly devastating because it appears meaningless. You look around and see people who seem content with surface-level existence, and you wonder, why can't I just be like them? Why can't I just turn off this relentless drive for deeper meaning and simply enjoy the shallow end of the pool? But Jung would tell you this: you can't go back. Once consciousness expands, once you've tasted psychological depth, returning to unconscious participation in collective life becomes impossible. You've eaten from the tree of knowledge, and there's no way to unknow what you now understand about yourself, about others, about the hidden machinery that drives human behavior. This is the hidden problem at the heart of your loneliness. You're mourning not just the loss of connection with others, but the loss of your former self, the version of you who could belong easily, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions, who accepted reality as it was presented. That self is dying, and every death, even a psychological one, requires grief. What most people don't realize is that this loneliness doesn't just affect your social life, it fundamentally rewires your entire psychological operating system. The consequences are invisible at first: subtle shifts in how you perceive, interpret, and respond to the world around you. But over time, these shifts accumulate into something undeniable: you become a different person living in a different reality, even while occupying the same physical space as everyone else. One of the first unseen consequences is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance on steroids. You're constantly aware of the gap between what people say and what they actually mean, between the values they claim to hold and the behaviors they actually exhibit, between the reality they present and the unconscious patterns driving them. This awareness is exhausting. You start to see the defense mechanisms everywhere, the projection, the denial, the rationalization, the avoidance. And once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Jung warned that this heightened awareness often triggers what he called a confrontation with the shadow. Your shadow contains all the parts of yourself you've rejected or suppressed to fit in. As you outgrow your environment, these suppressed aspects demand recognition. You might feel sudden anger toward people who seem content with superficiality. You might experience guilt for wanting distance from those who love you. You might even feel shame for desiring a radically different life than the one you've built. These emotions aren't signs of moral failure. They're signals that unconscious material is surfacing, asking to be integrated. But here's the trap: most people at this stage either project these feelings outward or turn them inward as self-punishment. They either label everyone else as asleep and ignorant, falling into spiritual superiority, or they conclude that something is fundamentally wrong with themselves, spiraling into depression and self-doubt. Both responses are defense mechanisms against the real work, sitting with the discomfort of transformation without seeking an easy escape. Another unseen consequence is neurological. Your brain literally begins to process social information differently. Research in neuroscience shows that when we're deeply misaligned with our environment, our stress response systems activate chronically. You might notice physical symptoms: exhaustion after social interactions, heightened sensitivity to noise or emotional chaos, a visceral need for silence and solitude that feels almost urgent. This isn't antisocial behavior, it's your nervous system protecting itself from environments that no longer match your internal frequency. The cultural consequence is perhaps the most insidious. We live in a society that worships extroversion, constant connectivity, and consensus reality. The message is clear: if you're not thriving in groups, if you prefer depth over breadth in relationships, if you need substantial time alone to process your inner world, then something must be wrong with you. This cultural gaslighting makes you doubt your own experience, question your own sanity, and wonder if you're just making excuses for social inadequacy. But Jung understood something crucial: neurosis often arises not from psychological weakness, but from the soul being prevented from following its natural path. When you silence your insights to preserve relationships, when you suppress your questions to maintain harmony, when you betray your values to avoid loneliness, the psyche rebels. This rebellion manifests as anxiety, depression, chronic emptiness, or the haunting sense that your life lacks meaning despite appearing successful on the surface. The most dangerous unseen consequence is this: you can become so accustomed to abandoning yourself that you forget what your own voice sounds like. You can spend so much energy managing other people's perceptions that you lose touch with your inner authority entirely. And when that happens, the loneliness becomes permanent, not because you're separated from others, but because you're separated from yourself. The rebellion begins not with external action, but with internal permission. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to let the mask crack completely. Permission to acknowledge that you've changed in ways that make returning to your former life impossible. This is not about burning bridges or making dramatic exits. It's about something far more radical: choosing psychological honesty over comfortable belonging. Jung believed that the first act of true rebellion is withdrawing your projections. Stop waiting for others to change so you can feel less alone. Stop expecting your family to suddenly understand your transformation. Stop hoping your old friends will develop the same hunger for depth that now drives you. These expectations are projections, unconscious attempts to make the outer world conform to your inner reality. When you withdraw them, something powerful happens: you reclaim the energy you've been spending on disappointment and redirect it toward your own development. The second act of rebellion is embracing what Jung called active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with your inner world as if it were as real and important as your outer circumstances. This means treating your thoughts, dreams, intuitions, and inner voices not as distractions from real life, but as essential data about who you're becoming. Most people only pay attention to their inner world when it becomes unbearably loud, through crisis, breakdown, or illness. But you can choose to listen before it screams. Here's the counterintuitive truth that unlocks everything: loneliness loses its power the moment you stop treating it as a problem to solve. When you cease viewing your solitude as evidence of failure and instead recognize it as necessary space for psychological reorganization, it transforms from punishment into preparation. You're not being exiled from connection, you're being invited into a deeper relationship with yourself, one strong enough to sustain you when external validation is absent. Historical examples illuminate this path. Friedrich Nietzsche spent years in relative isolation, physically ill and intellectually alienated from his contemporaries, yet he produced some of the most revolutionary philosophical work in human history. His loneliness wasn't incidental to his genius, it was essential to it. Similarly, Carl Jung himself experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological isolation during which he questioned everything he thought he knew. That dark night of the soul became the foundation for his life's work. The practical rebellion involves radical honesty in your relationships. Instead of performing the version of yourself that maintains harmony, you speak your actual thoughts, not aggressively, not with the intent to prove superiority, but simply as truth-telling. You stop diluting your insights to make them palatable. You stop asking permission to explore ideas that fascinate you. You stop apologizing for needing more depth than small talk provides. This doesn't mean becoming harsh or dismissive. True individuation, Jung insisted, deepens compassion rather than destroying it. You can see clearly that most people are operating unconsciously while still holding love for them. You can recognize that different people are at different stages of psychological development without needing to rank them in a hierarchy of worth. The rebellion is against self-betrayal, not against other people. Another crucial element: you must consciously grieve what you're losing. The old sense of belonging. The comfort of not questioning everything. The ease of fitting in. Jung understood that every psychological rebirth requires a symbolic death. You cannot become who you're meant to be while clinging to who you used to be. The loneliness is the space between, the void where the old self dies and the new self gestates. This is how you break free, not by escaping loneliness, but by moving through it consciously, extracting its wisdom, and allowing it to refine rather than destroy you. Here is the truth that changes everything, the realization that reframes your entire experience and reveals why this loneliness was never meant to destroy you. What you've been interpreting as isolation is actually individuation. What feels like abandonment is actually arrival. What appears to be the end of connection is actually the beginning of authentic relationship, first with yourself, and then with others who have undertaken the same journey. Carl Jung spent his life studying the human psyche's drive toward wholeness, and he discovered something most people never grasp: the loneliness of outgrowing your environment is not a bug in your psychological development, it's a feature. It's the necessary passage between two fundamentally different ways of existing in the world. The first way is unconscious participation in collective life, where your identity is borrowed from external sources and your sense of worth depends on constant validation. The second way is conscious individuation, where your identity emerges from within and your sense of worth is self-generated. You cannot move from one to the other without passing through loneliness. It's the psychological equivalent of the void between trapeze bars, that terrifying moment when you've let go of one bar but haven't yet grasped the next. Most people never make the leap. They spend their entire lives clinging to the first bar, the familiar bar, the collective bar, because the emptiness in between looks like death. But you've already let go. That's why you're here, reading this, searching for understanding. You're suspended in that void right now, and it feels like falling. But here's what Jung discovered through his own confrontation with the unconscious: you're not falling. You're being reorganized at a level so deep that your ego cannot comprehend it. The self, that central organizing principle larger than your conscious mind, is doing the work that loneliness makes possible. Think about what's actually happening beneath the surface of your isolation. Your psyche is withdrawing energy from relationships and situations that no longer serve your evolution. This withdrawal isn't rejection, it's redirection. All that energy you once poured into maintaining your persona, into fitting in, into managing how others perceive you, is now being redirected inward. And in that inward space, something extraordinary is forming, your authentic self, the person you were always meant to become before the world told you who to be. This is why the loneliness feels so intense. You're not just losing connection with others, you're losing connection with your former identity. Every time you sit in a room full of people and feel like a stranger, you're experiencing the death of the self you constructed to belong. Every time a conversation feels hollow, you're witnessing the collapse of meaning structures that once sustained you. Every time you choose solitude over superficial connection, you're choosing your soul's integrity over your ego's comfort. Jung called this process the emergence of the self with a capital S, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, integrated and whole. But the self cannot emerge while you're still identified with the persona, still dependent on external validation, still terrified of standing apart from the collective. The loneliness strips away these dependencies layer by layer, revealing what remains when everything borrowed falls away. And here's the paradox that completes the transformation: the moment you stop needing others to understand you is precisely when you become capable of genuine intimacy. When you're no longer abandoning yourself to belong, you can finally show up as yourself in relationships. When you're no longer fragmenting your truth to maintain harmony, you can finally offer your whole being to connection. When you're no longer seeking completion in others, you can finally meet them as equals rather than as solutions to your incompleteness. This is what Jung meant when he said individuation doesn't lead to isolation from humanity but to deeper integration with it. You don't leave people behind, you relate to them differently. You see their struggles with more compassion because you've faced your own shadow. You understand their unconscious patterns without judgment because you've witnessed your own. You hold space for their journey without needing them to be further along than they are. But the connections that do form at this stage are categorically different from what came before. They're not based on shared illusions or mutual dependence. They're not maintained through performance or pretense. They're rooted in something Jung called psychological resonance, the recognition that occurs when two people who have done the inner work encounter each other. These connections are rare, but they're real in a way that superficial bonds never were. The final realization is this: the loneliness you feared was actually preparing you for a life of depth, integrity, and inner alignment. It was burning away everything false so that what's true could finally breathe. It was creating the space necessary for you to hear your own soul above the noise of collective expectation. It was teaching you that you are whole unto yourself, that you don't need to be understood by everyone to be valid, and that standing alone in your truth is more fulfilling than belonging through self-betrayal. You are not lost. You are not broken. You are not failing at connection. You are early in a new way of being that most people never discover. You are learning to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. And yes, it's lonely. Yes, it's disorienting. Yes, it demands more courage than you thought you possessed. But ask yourself this: what kind of life becomes possible when you stop trying to be understood by everyone and start being faithful to yourself? What relationships become available when you stop performing and start existing? What meaning emerges when you stop seeking it externally and start generating it from within? The loneliness you've been enduring isn't leading you away from life. It's leading you home, to yourself, to your truth, to the person you were always meant to become. And from that home, rooted and whole, you can finally offer the world something it desperately needs: someone who chose depth over comfort, authenticity over approval, and soul over safety. This is not the end of your journey. This is the moment you realize that everything you thought you were losing was actually making space for everything you were meant to find.